And you can start whenever you are ready, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. It's really great to be here today. And I'm only sorry that I can't be in the same room as everyone, as I'm sure we're all sick and tired of having to do lectures over Zoom. But nevertheless, the advantage is that we can have people from all around the world. And so there's a silver lining to the format of lecturing in this kind of online setting. I'm delighted to speak today in part because the timing couldn't be better for me to be giving a lecture like this. As you'll see, this past 2 weeks has been a really impressive and let's say exciting set of weeks for research and discussions surrounding ancient genomics. And so I'll be highlighting some of the aspects of that. I look forward to the Q&A where we can maybe dive deeper into some of the details. Although I will say this lecture is structured kind of in basically a 50-50 format. The first half is I'll do my best to wear the hat of an archaeogeneticist, which I'm glad to see I have colleagues in the room who can correct me when I make mistakes, and I look forward to those corrections. But I'm going to try to basically give a deep dive into the recent papers over the last 2 to 3 years that outline a very, very complex picture of social genome, or basically human genomics in the region of Central Eurasia and Western China. And then in a way, use that as a point of reference, or let's say as a point of conversation to delve into some of the details of the archaeology. Obviously, within the span of a 45-minute lecture, I won't be able to touch on all the examples that would be relevant. So I've decided to use the occasion of a new paper, which is coming out very soon, within the next 2 weeks, to illustrate a few specific details with hopes that that will generate and stimulate conversation about other examples and other areas where we might understand this complex social world that ultimately is the cause, or let's say root of the genetic signatures that we're recovering now. So let's get started. One of the easiest ways, in a sense, for archaeologists to get a grasp on what's going on in any region, but in particular in Central Eurasia, has been to approach it sort of from the bottom up, if you will. You know, what do we eat? How do we structure our economies? And thus, the bulk of the research, I would argue, in the last 20 years in the region, from an archaeological perspective, has really sought to understand key thresholds or benchmarks in the social economies of the region. So whether it's the debates about the domestication of the horse, which I'll return to later in the lecture, or the expansion of, my clicker is not working here, the expansion of domestic pastoralist economies, the questions have oftentimes been left with, have sort of stopped around the idea of, you know, what did we do in a very functional way? But the truth of the matter is that each of the economic signatures that we've recorded, be they the rise of the horse in Botai, in the central part of the steppe as early as the middle 4th millennium, or its subsequent actual domestication around 2000 BC in the western portions of the steppe, or the spread of grains along the so-called Inner Asian Mountain Corridor, or the relationships that form between these communities, is actually a process that relates to people. It relates to as much to how people exchange, talk to one another, interact, battle, who knows, right? All the different forms of communication and interaction, what I call participation, that shape social worlds. And so it's interesting to understand this sort of movement in archaeology from the framework of genetics, especially since not more than 20, 25 years ago, our understanding of that social world was fairly generic. And I say that not to be critical, but you'll understand what I mean in a minute. As recently as the mid-90s, around shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, Western scholars were rapidly introduced to the 80 or more years of Soviet literature that basically defined the archaeology of Central Asia. And without getting into an enormous conversation about what the tendencies of that archaeology were, what I can say is two sort of sweeping statements, which you can criticize me or agree with me. The first sweeping statement is that our Soviet and later Russian colleagues are indeed the masters of this archaeology. These are the individuals who, if you dive into the local regional sequences of ceramics and stone tools and economic scenarios, these are individuals who can tell you the diversity and range of information that has been collected over the last 100 years now. At the same time, the models that came out of that Soviet literature were oftentimes very generic and very sweeping. So for example, in her masterful work, Elena Kuzmina described the spread of Bronze Age steppe tribes through this sequence of migratory movements. Documented from her perspective at the time, which started in the 1960s, primarily through material culture. So the shape and size of ceramic pots, the form and layout and scale of houses and burials. And this extremely detailed archaeological study, which resulted in a massive and encyclopedic book on the Bronze Age of Eurasia, essentially outlined a process by which human populations moved in various phases across the Eurasian steppe and populated other areas. And in a sense, her focus on this was not only archaeological, but also linguistic and in a sense ethnic, as part of a Soviet interest in understanding the origins of various ethnoses, basically like social identities. And in a sense, this precedent that was set in the 1990s was what was immediately absorbed by Western scholars and has been reproduced. And in fact, at that time, when I got engaged in the archaeology of Central Asia a few years later, in the late 90s, this was sort of the standard benchmark, right? Was understanding the world through this picture of massive steppe migrations. And we'll come back to some alternatives to this in a minute. But what I want to point out here is that this precedent model is ultimately what has been reproduced in many cases uncritically, at least in the early days of genomics, in the study of Central Asian populations. So here, for example, we see one of the first, in 2015, two major studies were published. One was illustrating the spread of the Yamnaya population into Europe, which I did not cite here. That was the group that documented a massive genetic turnover amongst the corded ware populations of Western Europe. But they also document this purported migration of Yamnaya communities. So basically, early pastoralist communities of the North Caucasus out towards the Altai Mountains. And this is a model that wasn't first imagined by geneticists. This was a model that was first described through archaeological and morphometric studies of human remains as early as, again, the 1960s. But I draw your attention more to the map at the bottom. Here you see a map not very much unlike that of Elena Kuzmina's map, in which you see a massive blob called the Andronovo culture, and within it, an emerging set of smaller blobs that we could identify as being different communities. And yet the reality is this study, and again, I'm only being critical because it's as many as 7 years ago. So we have the opportunity to look back on it in a way and smile, is that, this was based on essentially 5 samples from the Sintashta region and only 3 samples from what we would identify as Andronovo contexts. And yet these narratives were being reproduced. And this is in spite of the fact that by 2015, a number of very, very detailed studies had been published looking at the complex sets of interactions that defined Central Eurasia. So there was a misstep between population genomics and what was going on in archaeology. And you say, oh yeah, but that must have gone away relatively quickly. Well, actually, by 2018, we were still roughly in the same boat. And I'll come back to summarize some more details about how this all plays out. But by 2018, a whopping 137 ancient genomes were published from the Eurasian steppe. However, from my understanding of the data set, only one of them actually dated to the 2nd millennium BC. And in fact, nevertheless, the authors chose to produce, again, these maps of sweeping arrows. And there's a sense, a sort of a fascination that both archaeologists and geneticists share, which is that maps must have arrows on them, and they must show the ways in which populations, massively transition east to west, north to south, et cetera. I'm positioning these genetic studies in a sense as a starting point. And I actually am not trying to really criticize them as much as I am to establish the fact that the genomic world, the genomic research world was extremely nascent as recently as 2018. And by 2019, when a larger study was published by Bigash Narasimhan, Nick Patterson, myself, Ron Pinhasi, David Reich, as the sort of amongst 65 or more or 90 authors, I can't remember how many now there were, the capacity for us to go from what was published in 2015, which might have been 100 genomes or something, to 500 or more genomes, plus take advantage of the collective corpus of information, allowed us to basically make much more robust understandings of what's actually going on amongst local populations. And so again, this is sort of a caveat then to my criticisms of the earlier studies. In a lot of ways, they didn't have a choice but to use essentially uncritically some of the earlier models that were presented by Soviet or other scholars, because there wasn't enough of a data set from which to really change any of that picture. But this is no longer the case. And so my lecture today really departs from that 2019 study, which I was grateful to be a part of, where we were able to bring a much more robust data set to the table, as well as take advantage of the cumulative efforts of many teams around the world who were trying to understand the greater complexity of Central Eurasia throughout the early, middle, and later Bronze Age. In addition to this study, of course, we now have 3 or 4 more years worth of work. And I'll be touching on some of the more critical studies that have come out since 2019 in reference to what we argued in the paper, in this particular paper. But let me first summarize a little bit of the results. And again, I look forward to some of the critiques or comments from geneticists if I get something wrong. What is fairly well established, I think now, from a genetic perspective, is that there was a large and well-distributed substrate of basically early Holocene, if not Pleistocene, genetic ancestry that defined the majority of the Eurasian steppe prior to 3000 BC, and ultimately up to about 2000 BC. At that critical turning point, roughly 3300 or so, we see an impulse of new genetic ancestry brought on by what is essentially only described, can only be defined as and verified as this Yamnaya migration of a population of North Caucasian pastoralists who seem to burst across the steppe without many remnants and implant a social context in the Altai Mountains. And I'll come back to the details of what that looks like socially in a minute, but let's just agree on the fact that the genomics are unequivocal in that relationship between an Eastern and Western population. And the chronology suggests that there's an origin in the West moving to the East. However, outside of that particular event, or let's say that particular burst of migration, there's an incredibly complex soup or a matrix of genetics that underlies the Eurasian continent, Central Eurasian landmass, one that can be defined by a variety of earlier and later clinal interactions, admixtures. One of them, of course, is a Neolithic or even pre-Neolithic cline of Eurasian hunter-gatherers. So Eastern European hunter-gatherers mixing with Eastern Siberian or Western steppe hunter-gatherers. And these characteristics can be seen in early Bronze Age communities or late Neolithic communities such as Botai. But as well, you also see a cline along what I would again describe as the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor. And here we see the introduction of Southwest Asian genetics, purportedly essentially Iranian farmer genetics in its earliest instance, moving in and blending in bidirectional ways with this primordial, or let's say base Western Siberian hunter-gatherer ancestry. And the proportionality of that is bidirectional. So there does appear to be a genetic movement along with some other innovations, which I'll get to in the archaeology portion of the talk, to illustrate this IMAC or Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor cline, which moves between essentially the northern fringes of the Iranian plateau all the way up to, in some cases, the Altai Mountains. And we'll touch on those factors in a minute. And you can see here amongst some of the Okuniev and other populations, the potential for this Southwest Asian ancestry. When we look at it in terms of a PCA, it becomes almost more interesting and more drastic. Here again, we see the Afanasyevo material separated by thousands of kilometers, but almost indistinguishable from that of the Yamnaya. Whereas the rest of the steppe world, encircled here in this green line, appears to be stretched along an east-west cline that would make sense from a geographic distribution perspective. As well, we see the IMAC cline drawing populations from far south in this geography up into what is essentially a near steppic geography, as well as in reverse, right? You see dots here from Gonur sort of further down to the south, and you see Dali, this particular site that we'll be talking about today, drawing away from the steppe toward these more southerly communities. This is all representative then of a very complex genetic world, one which is not simply described as mass migrations or movements with big arrows, but in fact, arrows that are much more nuanced and ones that take a more archaeological or demand a more archaeological focus if we're really to truly understand what's going on. And along those lines, I'll illustrate to you this sort of map, the images at the top here, where you can see even within the green blob, so to speak, you have Botai, Central Steppe, Dali, Okuniev, each of these communities illustrating slightly nuanced and different sets of regional interactions and sort of edge effects that bring unique elements of ancestry into the database. And of course, this is on the basis of something like 50 steppe samples from the early phase, the early Bronze Age. When we get to the later Bronze Age, as I'll address further on in the talk, we can really say even a lot more because our data set is so much more expanded. But for the moment, I want to stay in this pre-2000 BC era to understand a little bit more about what's going on in this critical area of the northeastern steppe, kind of in this portion of the map right here, which is a very complex genetic world between the time of 3000 and 2000 BC. After the 2019 paper by Narasimhan, a number of other key papers were published, specifically looking at the relationship between the northeastern steppe region of Eurasia and points further east, so both East Asia and Mongolia. And while I won't go into those further eastern scenarios, it's kind of out of the context of the talk today, the fact that these two papers, both Zhang et al. And Wang et al., illustrated sample sets from this critical circumaltaic region begins to throw nuance into the ways in which the Afanasyevo, the sort of transplanted Afanasyevo genetics began to influence or not the regional communities that we see around them. So by 2020, Jiang et al. Published a handful of Chimor-Czech genetics, which I'll talk a little bit about from an archaeological perspective in a minute. But you can see here that the Chimor-Czech communities identified according to their archaeological signature appear to have quite diversified genetic profiles. And so what they've argued is that these profiles reflect in some cases, similarities to the site of Dali, which is the site where I've been working and which I'll talk in detail about, but also fit with other frameworks. In other words, they can be fitted with Botai, essentially a remnant population of ANE or Western steppe hunter-gatherers, and groups with this Iranian-related ancestry. So they do see, again, this influence of the Inter-Asian mountain corridor making its way into Chimor-Czech. I'll come back to this in a minute. Wang et al., while they had fewer samples amongst the Chimor-Czech, identified some other interesting features, one of which both corroborate, in a sense, some of the observations made by Jiang et al., but also throw a little bit of nuance into the picture. They clearly illustrate that some of the populations of the Chimor-Czech were related to this Turanian or Southwest Asian ancestry, but they also illustrate some relationships with Yamnaya and Afanasyevo ancestry, which is then supported by some later studies. And so what we begin to realize is that the relationships between these various communities was nothing similar. There was not sort of a uniform set of practices, but in fact, within various communities, there was a diversity of genetic ancestry being reflected, likely due to various channels of communication and cultural and social participation. Which brings us to yesterday's publication. And again, as I said to you earlier, I'm extremely excited that this paper was published yesterday, because if it had been published next week, I would have had a harder time talking about this wonderful set of information. But here again, we see a study done, just published yesterday in Nature, on the genomic origins of Western China and essentially the Tarim Basin. And again, incorporating a number of samples relevant to our conversation, specifically in the Altai, but also then in the more arid regions of Western China. And the results of this study are both unexpected and expected. So there's sort of a variety of different things that we need to unpack before we can truly understand what's going on. So I'll do my best, given that this is a new paper. This map just shows some of the samples that were considered. The key samples, the new samples, came from these sites here in image B, but this was the comparative set of information that they used to understand and model the genomics of their data set. And this just shows the chronology. The take-home message essentially revolves around four key genomic packets, if you will, genomic types. One, the earlier of the two are these Jungarian EBA and EBA2 individuals. And what these individuals illustrate are three-way admixtures. So essentially a compromise between Wang et al. And Jiang et al. This paper illustrates essentially a three-way compromise, where we have these individuals essentially incorporating a significant amount of Afanasyevo ancestry, as well as essentially this primordial hunter-gatherer ancestry, as well as in some cases, and in this case, no IMAC ancestry. So these two individuals do not show any relationship to Dali or any points towards the IMAC. They can be modeled essentially as effectively, 20 to 40% Neolithic local ancestry, and about 60 to 70%, 50 to 70% Afanasyevo. But what's interesting is that their neighboring populations, which are not shown in pie graphs, so I just summarized it in text, they also analyzed a handful of Chimorchek samples. And those Chimorchek samples, which essentially operate in the exact same geography. So we're talking essentially about these communities here, 21, right? So 21 is Chimorchek, and these are the gray samples are the new ones. 21, so Chimorchek samples, again, show that compromise between a primordial A&E basis, so a hunter-gatherer genetic core, as well as IMAC or Southwest Asian genetic relationships, as well as essentially Afanasyevo portions. So we see this sort of complex set of ancestry being expressed by neighboring communities, in some cases not more than hundreds of kilometers away from one another, and essentially chronologically at the same time, yet with considerable differences in how they're interacting with different people and how they're not necessarily interacting culturally, but how they're interacting genetically. I'll also point out here, this is the unsupervised admixture plot, which basically just shows the components of ancestry as related to a broader sequence. And what you can see here are the samples from the Tarim Basin and their nearest neighbors. This is a Paleolithic site here, a Neolithic site from Western Siberia. So these communities clearly have a relationship in admixture terms with some really deep time ancestry in Central and Northern Eurasia. But what's interesting about it then is the next set of communities who are not contributors to their genetics, but nevertheless are not very distant in terms of their overall genetic ancestry, are those communities of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor. So Dali, Kumsai, Merike is not quite in the IMAC. But Dali, which is a site we'll be talking a lot about, figures prominently in the calculations of outgroup analysis in this study, which makes the genetics of the later individuals in this study, the Tarim EMBA, which are basically the mummies of Xinjiang dating to post 2000 BC, all the more interesting. These communities show no contribution from any of the aforementioned groups. These populations show very, very deep, long-standing genetic ancestry from basically late Pleistocene communities. And so what you're seeing here is a scenario which, as they describe it, shows an extreme degree of separation between what's going on in the north of the Altai and what's going on in the desert regions of the Tarim Basin. Now, this map is an interesting one, and that one, it takes a minute to really understand what's going on. The authors, I think, did both a really, really clever and somewhat confusing thing with this map. So it takes a minute to kind of digest it. So let's go through it. The argument is basically that the Tarim mummies, so these are the later Bronze Age, middle Bronze Age communities. This date to about 1800 BC. These communities were isolated genetically, but connected culturally. And we're going to come back to that theme here in a minute. But when we look at the earlier phase, this early Bronze Age populations up here in the north, what we see is a really, really interesting chronology of admixture. So we take out of the picture in a way the Tarim Basin mummies, because they have a very, very early genetic signature of admixture between Western Siberian and basically what is this ancient North Eurasian population. If we look at this batch of early Bronze Age populations kind of extending throughout this mountainous region here, the northern reaches of the Inter-Asian mountain corridor, we see a series of really interesting admixture chronologies. So for example, the site of Dali, which we'll be addressing specifically, has its own chronological sequence, meaning the actual samples themselves dating to something like 2700 BCE. But the admixture events that would have brought this unique set of genetics to Dali, which includes this portion from Southwest Asia, here denoted as Gyeoksur, and you can see that in blue here somewhere. It's a bit confusing. Here's the Gyeoksur Neolithic, this pinkish color, sorry. So Gyeoksur is reflected in the Dali sample, Gyeoksur being essentially a proxy for this Southwest Asian genetics. Yet that admixture seems to take place thousands of years earlier amongst the population. In other words, there seems to be a signature of an even earlier set of connectivities throughout the Inter-Asian mountain corridor, bringing specific kinds of genetics into the northern reaches. But what's unique about the data set here, and why this map is a little bit confusing, is that even though the Tarim mummies post-date most of these communities, their ancestry is so old that it becomes a very useful modeling tool to understand what aDNA or early Eurasian ancestry would have looked like amongst even populations that predate them. So they can use the Tarim mummy ancestry, because it's so old, essentially to remodel some of the ways we understand these communities here. And thus we begin to get a slightly clearer picture for understanding the relationships between, say, Dali and the Chimerchek populations, which have, albeit all different proportions, similar genetic components, as well as other populations throughout the Inter-Asian mountain corridor. So again, Afanasyevo standing out boldly in green is reflected in these two Jungarian samples, which are very, very close, say, in geographic space to Dali, but very, very different in terms of their genetic ancestry. Likewise, throughout the Inter-Asian mountain corridor, then we see a unique and somewhat similar characterization of ancestry that's reflected all the way over to the Chimerchek. And in a sense, there's other samples within the Chimerchek that reflect this Afanasyevo admixture. The final point I'll make about this admixture soup, if you will, is the Afanasyevo right now are conceptualized as a relatively homogeneous genetic code. However, there's emerging evidence, albeit only one sample, again, published by Wang et al., that suggests that not everybody in the Afanasyevo culture community had exactly the same genetic ancestry. In fact, although the group is relatively well sampled, there does open up the idea that there were communities and outliers that fall within the Afanasyevo cultural community who aren't 100%, or let's say even at all, related from a genetic perspective. So the Tarim study basically illustrates to us a couple of key points. One, that there's an extremely complex set of vectors of connectivity, genetic connectivity in northeastern, let's say the Altai, Circum-Altai and the IMAC. The other thing that it illustrates is that while this connectivity was likely driving enormous trends in culture and innovation and technology and economics, it didn't necessarily demand that these populations be genetically overlapping. In other words, there seems to be this clear isolation amongst the Tarim mummies as late as 1800 BC, but there's also a very, very clear signature of cultural interaction, which we think, and I think, begins far earlier, possibly even as early as the third or fourth millennium BCE. So this narrative then demands that we leave genetics for a moment and delve back into the archaeology to understand how this extremely complex set of long-term genetic trends takes shape. from a personal or social perspective. So this brings us then to an idea which I'm kind of, in a sense, I'm not quite sure how to say or how I feel about it. This is an idea that has emerged out of my research in a very slow way, but at the same time has become something of a useful tool for us to understand a lot of different aspects of Central Eurasian society. And in a lot of ways is a counter argument to some of those earlier models and arrows, maps of arrows that we see, because it doesn't demand necessarily a genetic component. It doesn't demand migration, but it also doesn't preclude it as a possibility. So it's sort of one of these catch-all theories in a way that allows us to understand that geography and humans overlap in ways, let's say humans utilize their geography in ways that are diverse, and sometimes it's genetic and sometimes it's not. But most importantly, it's rooted in practice, and it's rooted in the ways in which people I guess, connect their life ways. And so this is just tracing you through some of the early writings that I did to sort of formulate this idea, initially thinking about it primarily as a corridor for pastoralism, in which the mountainous regions, the ecotones of the mountains running from basically the Hindu Kush to the Altai, present a sort of homogeneous foothill, but not totally homogeneous, but let's say comparable foothill ecology, which would have been useful to populations who were semi-mobile, some of whom might have been more sedentary, but nevertheless who were engaged in this relatively productive landscape and likely were interacting in a way. Again, this is sort of supportive of that cline that we saw between Southwest Asia and northeastern portions of the IMAC. The root of this actually stemmed, though, from something well outside of human genetics and well outside of even necessarily clear archaeological ties. When I proposed the model back in 2000, or it was published in 2012, but I was writing about it as early as 2008 or even earlier, I was essentially looking at the differences between Eastern, Central, and Western Eurasia in terms of the economic basis. Again, this kind of rudimentary approach to understanding society based on what they do with their daily lives. And what you can see, this is a very crude assembly of materials taken at a time when there wasn't such a clear compilation of archaeofauna, but nevertheless it showed a pretty strong cleavage between the Eastern steppe and the IMAC, the Central steppe, which was horse dominant, and the Western steppe, which appeared to be more cattle dominant. This pattern, which albeit based on relatively scanty data in the early phases, so in other words, this is the early Bronze Age data, is supported by my own anecdotal excavations at places like Bigash, where you see this sort of consistent pattern of sheep-goat dominance in southeastern Kazakhstan in terms of the domestic economy, and only a short and a very limited rise in horses. And of course, now I'm very glad to find that I didn't find any domesticated horses at 3000 BC, because we know now that those domesticated horses of the kind that we're imagining didn't really make their way across the steppe in significant numbers until after 2000 BC. So our inklings of this, our 2 to 3%, might reflect that initial burst of domesticated horses, even at a small campsite like Bigash. But there's been much more robust work on this than my own, especially for the periods post-dating 2000 BC. And what both of these studies illustrate, Bendry, whose article was seminal and came out about the same time as mine in 2012, for understanding the distribution of animal proportions amongst various pastoralist economies, set the stage for understanding the ecological basis for how populations were actually utilizing their environments and moving. This is followed up now by a more recent paper by Ashley Haruda, which essentially concludes roughly the same thing, but in slightly greater detail, and she relates it to more specific ecological contexts. But all of them basically illustrate this like tripartite division between greater intensity of cattle in the west, greater intensity of sheep in the southeast, and sort of a distribution of horses that has, well, let's just say a slightly more equivocal distribution, but one that was more intensified in the central north. So this then brings us to a couple of our case studies. And I've mentioned the site of Dali a number of times, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on that, but I'll be also discussing a little bit the site of Bigash because there's data from it that's relevant. The site of Dali and Tasbas, which are essentially neighbors, only 1 kilometer away from one another, are located at roughly 1,600 meters elevation in the foothills of the Jungar Mountains. And here you can see just over the mountainside on our Google Maps 3D image, We can see the Ili River Basin in the upper right-hand corner, and over the mountains and hills, you're essentially looking into the Jungar Basin. So not far over those mountains is in fact the site of Nileke, the one that has that extremely different genetic signature that doesn't relate to any of these sites. So again, we can imagine the geography of people living quite close to one another in which they just simply weren't intermarrying. And in other cases, communities who were much further afield, but nevertheless were interacting. And that's really the goal here. We're trying to understand how that's taking place. The first thing to understand about this region is that it's significantly different from the rest of the Eurasian steppe, in part because of its clear evidence for the rise of farming as part of the pastoralist economy from the 3rd millennium onward, at least. Here's the two sort of sites that in a way broke open the narrative in the roughly 10 years ago. And that was the site of Bigash and Taspas, both published again over the last 10 years. And these each showed cremation burial contexts. These are contexts with limited amounts of cremated human remains and other artifacts, but also which contain domesticated grains. And these two sites both date to the early to mid 3rd millennium. Bigash itself, the grains themselves date to conservatively 2200, although the direct dates place them more around 23 or 2400 BC. But regardless, we're looking at basically the first half to middle portion of the 3rd millennium BC in these two contexts for the arrival of domesticated grains. However, a more robust analysis of all the data that's out there now illustrates that this process of exchange between Eastern and Western domestic worlds, millet in the East, obviously, wheat, barley, and ultimately lentils from the West, were crossing throughout this Inter-Asian mountain corridor easily by 3000 BC and likely by far earlier. And again, it's just a question of getting chronological material, getting good chronologies and getting enough material. And here I'll point out, the number of sites that we now know about that draw into this conversation is now becoming overwhelming, and the actual data set is expanding. And so we're beginning to think that this process may have much earlier, even possibly Neolithic, origins. But nevertheless, the geography of it holds. And what we see then is that this relationship between communities in the Southwest, reflected in their genetics, is also reflected in the distribution and integration of at least Southwest Asian crops. What's interesting, on the other hand, however, is that the Eastern ties towards this, those of, say, the ties towards the Chimorchek, are not heavily represented in terms of agricultural productivity. And thus, when we think of millet agriculture in China, we don't see a direct genetic linkage thus far, at least, in terms of how it makes its way into the corridor. And so while we definitely know that the millets that are found throughout the Inter-Asian mountain corridor have their origins in terms of their broad domestication in China, we have a lot of open questions concerning exactly what that process looked like. And that's hopefully what we're getting at with this new study in a way from the Tarim Basin. Just to sort of lock things in a little bit, we can now see that some of the earliest dates on wheat are placed here at Taspas and Dali, with the caveat, of course, that the earliest now dated one is about a century or two or three earlier here in the Altai. But again, I see all of this, as do the authors, as just a simple matter of the extension of the corridor, which it was conceived as such, into the Altai. And I'll point out that Tong Tianlang Cave is indeed associated with Afanasyevo material. So again, a sort of crossing of genetic signatures and economic signatures that we might not expect, because essentially those Southwest domesticates couldn't have necessarily arrived in any other fashion. Just more about the spread of those wheats into China. I'll digress in a minute, but I wanted to point out that, when we think about the locations of those Tarim Basin mummies, they're essentially right in here. In fact, this point is essentially that of Xiaohe. And so this Inter-Asian corridor, this passage of wheats and Western domesticates into China, appears to have flowed over the mountains into these desert areas, but not necessarily in all cases along with a clear genetic tie. Which then brings us again to the sites of Dali and Taspas. And if we imagine these two sites as being essentially next door neighbors, which they are, and chronologically overlapping, it's quite fascinating to see how different their economies are reflected in pure archaeological terms. If these sites were located 100 kilometers away, one might make the argument that they were completely different types of societies, but in fact, they're next door neighbors. And so we have to begin to understand that the palimpsest, or let's say the layers of different economic strategies, can oftentimes be quite close to one another, in that different kinds of processes don't necessarily demand a whole regional homogeneity. You can have sites within other sites that are basically doing slightly different things as part of a more complex economic and social strategy. So this brings us then to the site of Dali, which I've mentioned a number of times, both from the genetics perspective as well as archaeological angles. And so I want to delve a little bit deeper into the site of Dali to begin to understand how it contributes to the conversation in significant ways. This is a paper that is in press as we speak. It should be out any day now. I was hoping on hopes that it would actually have already been released, but I'm promised by the editor that it will be out within a week or two in Asian perspectives. But this is a deep dive into the archaeology of the site of Dali, which again features prominently in a number of different other relating papers. And so I wanted to kind of give you a first blush at what the actual archaeology looks like in more detailed ways. This is just an overview of the site itself, taken from aerial photography, in which you can see kind of the layout. This is basically a slope, open territory slope pinned in by a handful of escarpments. Certainly not an area where you would imagine, a thriving city or a massive amount of settlement. But nevertheless, as you'll see, the archaeology reveals a quite intensive utilization, and one that brings some important points of reference for understanding the connectivity between the Eurasian mountain corridor and other regions. To take a look at the early Bronze Age phase, which is the oldest dated phase at the site, we see here two pit houses, both of which are relatively large and somewhat complex, with an interstitial midden full of material. And I could just say that this site is so rich in material that it took us years to just basically sort out all the different layers in chronology and make sure that we had all the details correct. And so while the excavations were completed as recently or as long ago as 2014 or 15, I guess the last season was 2018. We nevertheless took a number of years to really make sure that we produced a publication that was going to be sort of this benchmarks type site, in part because the chronology is so long, but also because of just the nature of the excavation and the details of the material. I'll also just point out that this is the context within which that skull fragment that was dated, that was published by Bigash in our 2019 paper, and the one that's being referenced by all these other publications is in fact was a displaced skull fragment, and so we had to get a direct date on it. So we're pretty confident in the chronology of at least the human itself. It was found within the context of the pit house, and because the site itself is surrounded, I'll go back quickly, by a handful of cemeteries. There's a cemetery structure here upslope and a cemetery setting down here below downslope, and we've only excavated a small number of burials. So the likelihood is that the cemetery up here actually has early Bronze Age burials that we just simply haven't excavated yet. And this is just a matter of time in archaeology at this point. And I'll get back to that in a minute. From a chronological perspective, I just want to kind of situate Dali and Taspas and Bigash in reference to some of the other communities that we've been talking about. In fact, Dali overlaps the final phases of what's called late Afanasyevo, which is a slightly different period, but one that's important to recognize, because when we talk about the Afanasyevo, we sometimes think of it as this one thing. But the Afanasyevo archaeological complex, if you will, has a life of its own. And when we think about those Jungarian EBA samples recently published, the archaeologists categorize those individuals as Afanasyevo, even though now we know that they are admixed in other ways. So because they're not in the basic Altaic region, and they're not the earliest necessarily of all the samples, we call them something different. But if we didn't have the benefits of DNA, those would have been Afanasyevo sites, in which case we wouldn't have been at all surprised to find that they have Afanasyevo genetics. So in a sense, what's more surprising is that they have other components within them, right? And so again, we have to be careful about understanding what these cultural categories mean, because none of them are static and none of them are sort of monolithic in their format. Nevertheless, if we think about the Afanasyevo as a cultural category and as a material category and as a chronological period, we can see here that Dali and Bigash in their early phases quite neatly overlap with that transition towards them and the Okunev. And just to remind you, the genetics of these different communities are really, really interestingly different. Here's your Afanasyevo Yamnaya group, a representative of a very, very different admixture than, say, Dali, which has this large Western steppe hunter-gatherer component, as well as the Okunev, which has a similar package to the to Dali, but also includes components of Eastern Asian hunter-gatherers. So my point being that while these three groups overlap chronologically, again, we're beginning to see this really diversified set of genetic signatures and ancestries. Nevertheless, when we compare the early ceramics from Dali, beautifully drawn and characterized by Paula Dumani Dupuy, who's been a co-director for the project for a number of years since her time as a graduate student. She's done a very, very astute job of going through the ceramic assemblages of Chimurchek and Okunev, and ultimately even Afanasyevo, to illustrate very, very clear stylistic and grammatical, in a sense, syntactic and stylistic semiotic uses of pottery. Thus, it's not surprising that we find relationships between Dali, Chimurchek, and Okunev from a genetic perspective at one level. These are populations whose aesthetics and essentially their way of understanding the world were relatively similar. And this Chimurchek pot here is really astoundingly identical almost to that which we find at Dali. But not so different as well from the Afanasyevo type. And these are sort of earlier graphics from our classic Afanasyevo cemeteries and classic Afanasyevo materials. But it's, to my eyes, it's only a skip and a jump away from what we're seeing with Dali, Chimurchek, and Okunev. So we're talking about very complex social processes, ones in which materials are being traded, techniques for making ceramics, techniques for making other artifacts, which I'll return to. And I'll just point out some of these lithics up here. Remember those lithics that we found at Taspas? These are very, very similar in terms of their shapes and formations, right? Now, lithics are like that. That's a commonality with small microliths. They don't come in such a wide variety of shapes and forms. Although I'm not an expert on lithics, I can tell you that they don't seem that different to me. But nevertheless, the forms that we see here from the Afanasyevo clearly seem to have relationships to some of the ways of making lithics that we find at sites like Taspas. This isn't just sort of something you wake up in the morning and figure out how to do. This is information that's flowing between communities, person to person, or very least through overall vocabularies of craft production. Another interesting observation from the site of Dali is that, in fact, it shares very direct animal genetic ancestry in terms of its domesticated sheep and goats. So here, for example, you see the site of Nizhnaya Soru, which is an Neolithic Afanasyevo site located in the Altai Mountains. And essentially, this sample, KO 1820110, has effectively identical genetic signatures to that sample from Dali. And so therefore they're indistinguishable. And then if we track through the genetic haplotypes, these are of course mitochondrial DNA, we're seeing very, very clear links between both domesticated sheep and goat throughout the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor tied to Afanasyevo sites. So when we think about the Afanasyevo community as a genetic community, we've always assumed that that means that the entirety of their life is being transported with the Yamnaya population. But what we're seeing is that there's a lot of other potential contributions, that the sheep appear to be related to an Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor trajectory as much as anything else. This isn't to dispute the human genome, just simply to suggest that there's mismatches between what's happening with the human genetics and other aspects of life and economy. Again, we go back to Dali and take a deeper dive into what's going on with these communities. We see that the early materials, and this is work by Taylor Hermes, who's currently at the Max Planck in Germany. These early samples from Dali and Taspas showing the isotopic components of their seasonal diet suggest that these populations were being foddered with millet. And so is it surprising that the millet doesn't reflect a genetic tie to East Asia? in terms of the populations? Not really, especially when you consider that they're growing millet in a completely different way. I've argued that they're basically growing millet to feed animals as opposed to themselves. So their adoption of millet, while a key aspect of interaction, is also reflecting a very, very different understanding of what that millet is for. And if we look, I believe it's the next slide. Yeah, if we look for the early sites of millet throughout Southwest Asia and essentially the extension of the Eurasian mountain corridor, a number of those sites are considered to be pastoralist sites. So what we're seeing here is the integration of farming, potentially not even so much for human diet, but potentially as much to promote animals. And this is a question now, of course, which raises some debate, and I'm more than happy to address those questions. But the issues at hand rely on the fact that we're talking about a diverse set of trajectories between genetics and practice, economics and craft, and other institutional domains. If Dali and Tasbas were the only sites, I would be willing to sort of, step down and say that this was sort of an anomaly. But over the last 10 years, we're seeing an abundance of IMAC sites that illustrate these kinds of patterns. The amazing work in Kyrgyzstan, currently being directed by Gidra Montuzaita, is blowing the top off of our understanding of farming in this region. The site of Chap-2, which is a high elevation site in the Kyrgyz Tian Shan, shows abundant investment in farming, to suggest that we probably have a variety of different economies going on throughout the corridor. This is, of course, not even labeling the sites in the Tarim Basin, which we discussed earlier, but essentially trying to draw in the relationships. And all the dots that you see on this map, which is the map essentially that we use for the publication, show direct ties in some brand, some element of culture or society or practice. All of these sites illustrate some direct communication in terms of transition and trade, interaction, and information flow. And this is the list. And I know we have people in the room like Alison Betts who've contributed an enormous amount of energy into documenting this process. And her work specifically from Adun Chalu and others, other regions of northwestern China, and its relationship to the Tarim Basin is something that you absolutely must take a look at. The article, the GenX article, somewhat sets out Alison's model as sort of a testable model, and in a way it is, and in a way it isn't. Alison, I look forward to hearing, I know you're here, so I look forward to hearing from you about your reactions in a sense, but because I thought that in a lot of ways, your article was essentially telling a very similar story to what I'm telling. The only point there is that you considered the idea that there could be a genetic tie, which was logical at the time, and I think many of us would have possibly assumed that. And so it is surprising that there wasn't a genetic tie from the mummies. But everything else seems to hold true, and that is the idea that these innovations were moving through the Eurasian mountain corridor in significant ways. So that brings us then back to our study and the use of arrows. And I want to criticize myself and my dear colleagues for this map. I fought against this map in the kindest of all fashions, and I lost, but that's okay. The map is an important one, and it illustrates a key set of points that were significant to some of the authors, and I'm not against that. But it also hides a lot of that same diversity that we just talked about. And so I want to talk a little bit briefly. I know I'm running out of time, and I apologize, but if you can give me 10 more minutes, we'll try to get through some of these details. That is the issues of the second millennium BC. And actually what I think is probably arguably one of the most important observations of Vagish's study is the second millennium BC and what's going on with the Andronovo. This is what it actually looks like under those arrows. The clinal distribution of Andronovo populations, in this case, using over 200, I think, samples from purportedly Andronovo types sites, illustrates not only a pretty significant, or let's say statistically significant division between what we can consider to be a Western steppe variant and a central and IMAC variant of the Andronovo, but also a widely distributed geography to those sites. And so one way of looking at that is sort of pointing to individual genomes and placing them on the map, which gets to be a bit mind-boggling. But another way of understanding that is to kind of look at this admixture plot and realize how far away some of these different populations are from one another in spite of being geographically close. So for example, if we take Sintashta as a bulk block population, There's also a number of outliers, and I'll show that in the next slide. But if we look at the Central Steppe region, which is differentiated ever so slightly from the Western Steppe by virtue of its integration of this green material, right? This BMAC style genetic ancestry. What we see is that there are sites that are very far away from one another, in some cases closer in genetic ancestry than those that are right next door. So Dali and Tasbas are literally 1 kilometer away from one another, but on this plot show each other's ancestry. They show an admixture decline being quite significantly different in terms of their proportionality of various components. Dashti Kozi is located literally right next door to the BMAC, yet it's ever so slightly further along the admixture plot than others. So the way of understanding the geography versus the genome is to recognize that the arrows are extremely multidirectional, and that in some cases weren't necessarily even in unidirectional flows, albeit when extrapolated at a large scale, you see that trend. And I'll go back to the previous map to illustrate that. Here you see this sort of third wave, if you will, of expansion out of Western Europe, with European admixture making its way back across the Eurasian steppe. And this is not to be denied. There's definitely a clear signature of European ancestry that's integrating itself in a stepwise way, no pun intended, into and down throughout the mountain corridor and other regions of the Eurasian steppe zone, with sort of a standard set of fall off. But within each one of these contexts, underneath that arrow is this complex set of regional ancestries. And I think nothing tells that story more elegantly than this wonderful plot conceptualized for the article, which shows, for example, the BMAC cluster, the main cluster of genetics ancestry, with all of these so-called outliers. These are individuals found in geographical proximity to this main cluster, but who have really, really different ancestry. This suggests, and the same can be said for the steppe. Here you see the main cluster of Western steppe ancestry with considerable amounts of both BMAC and other kinds of ancestry sort of in proximity to them geographically, but who are really, really different at the level of their genomic characterization. So this would lead me to believe that the Central Eurasian steppe, while trending towards this changeover in its genetic signature in the 2nd millennium BC, was also genetically and socially extremely diverse. And it's this context of diversity that I really want to emphasize, because I think that that's ultimately what's at the root of so much of what we see archaeologically. So going back, 20 years now, my first observations at the site of Bigash were that we had materials from all over the place, and we couldn't quite figure out how it was getting there. So we had, for example, very characteristic central steppe, golden earrings, as well as Siberian adornments, all within the same burials, essentially, all within the same category of burials. But beyond that, we had plenty of evidence, right, to suggest that populations of the steppe were already interacting in the 2nd millennium BC in significant ways in points to the south. Here you see Andronovo-style ceramics, right, steppe courseware ceramics found at the site of Sarazm, this major village site in the Zarafshan Valley of Tajikistan. It's not at all surprising then to see, that the site of Sarazm is essentially up here in this sort of valley of the Zarafshan. When we get all the way out into the BMAC, we have this characteristic set of urban, ostensibly hierarchical, and I guess you'd call it kind of mass-produced ceramics. But all around the site and in the fringes, you find these quote-unquote steppe ceramics, incised coursewares, materials more indicative of a steppe interface. So again, these incredibly large urban sites were not, it's not surprising in a way to find those genetic outliers represented even within the cemeteries of sites like Gonur. A key example of this is the site of Ojakli, excavated by one of my former students and colleagues, Lenny Rouse and Barbara Cheresetti, who basically illustrate that not only were these communities of pastoralists living on the outskirts of places like Gonur and other large cities, but they were in economic relationships with them. Here you see their local ceramics, their incised coursewares, the kinds of things that they would have used on a day-to-day basis for cooking, as well as a whole production kiln for pot stands that would have only have analogs in the urban context, wheel spun, produced for a different market. These are populations who were not sort of living on the fringe, but were rather participating in the cultural formation of what we understand to be the BMAC. And so they are genetic outliers, but from a social perspective, they're actually highly integrated, I think, and we need to reconsider how we sort of separate these populations within each regional context. The list goes on, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move quickly. We could look at burial style. This is, sites of the Qijia culture in Western China, throughout Western China, the Eurasian mountain corridor, Bigash, Dali, all the way to Gonur. We see a related vocabulary of how you bury your dead. What is a good way to bury your body? How do your relatives go on to the afterlife? What are the ways in which humans articulate their belief systems? These are things that are shared throughout this network, and which flow both genetically and agenetically throughout the system. And we need to look no further than the site of Xiaohe itself to see how sometimes things just don't map on, right? The genetics don't map on, the burial styles don't map on, but the wheat and the textiles and other aspects of their diet and pastoralist adaptation do map on. So here again, we see this sort of juxtaposition between what's going on genetically and what's going on culturally and socially. And this shouldn't be hugely surprising with the characterization of the Eurasian steppe as this highly dynamic social world of interaction. Last bit of examples. Apropos the textiles, because Xiaohe and those points in the Western desert, appear to be isolated, but on the other hand, we know that they're cosmopolitan, and they know that they're engaged with these various forms of craft and technology. If we look at the ceramics from Bigash, again, the work of Paula Dumani Dupuy, we see that textiles were used abundantly in the formation of ceramics, which leaves us with a wonderful record of the actual textile materials that were being used at the time. These are positive casts, essentially, of what the impressions in the ceramics themselves are. And I'll skip specifically to one of the particular forms. We know that we have very early forms of ceramics in the lowest layers of the site, which essentially illustrate a woven woolen textile. So some of the earliest potential evidence for wool textiles in the region, as well as twining. So using twisting the cordage in a different way than just simply you would expect from a standard spindle whorl. But as we move later in the sequence, we end up with a very, very unique textile impression, that of one that is a twill. Now, for those of you who are not experts in textiles, my understanding is that our most common known twill today is your jeans. So if you happen to be wearing jeans or dungarees, take a look down and you're probably wearing a twill material. And the reason why that's important is that twills are extremely durable, and they take a very specific set of weaving techniques to produce. You can't just simply hand weave them as easily as you could a sample box weave. So if we look at the chronology of these twills, we see that aside from a few very, very early examples in the West, Bigash and Western China kind of ring in as some of the earliest Eastern examples of twill manufacturing in the Eurasian arena. To make a twill, you need to have a loom of some kind that allows you to lift those 2-in-1 weft and basically the vertical lines of the stitch. And so that kind of a loom demands a real technological exchange. You don't just invent this thing on your own. And here, of course, are these early trousers from the late 2nd millennium BC, which were in fact a twill pattern. Basically, these are your earliest pair of jeans if you really want to kind of be sensational about it. So how do we understand this spread of these warp weft weighted looms? Well, the earliest examples come basically from the western portions of Eurasia, and the previous arguments had always been, well, they must have spread across the Eurasian steppe like everything else. But what we're beginning to understand is that these mountain regions aren't as imposing barriers as you might have expected. And in fact, this loom may have made its way across Iran and into the Eurasian steppe and onward to Western China, vis-a-vis the same pattern of people who would have actually had the most access and the most need for these kinds of durable textile pants. I'm not going to go into this section because we're out of time, and I want to leave time for the translation as well as the questions. But I just want to make one quick point about what this looks like in the later time period. By phase 2, Dali has a fundamental change in its ceramics. We think that they're producing metals, and we have very, very good evidence for their integration into a metallurgical network. We've been doing analysis of our slags and of our finished artifacts, And what it ultimately shows is that there's a very, very wide and diverse array of ores being imported into the site at this time. That array of ores, I'm sorry, I can't look at these too carefully for you now, that array of ores changes through time, and the networks that shape those arrays change through time. And so it's not unlike other brands of interaction that we see these dynamic and non-uniform networks taking place throughout the entirety of the Bronze Age. So what does all of this suggest for socializing ancient genomes? I think that what we can argue is that the genetic record has opened up a window for us that gives us a platform upon which to really talk about the specific ways in which communities interact. Interaction has been used for nearly a century or more as a term in anthropology that just describes this kind of limp interface between people. In other words, you interact and something happens. Well, the good news is there's different kinds of interaction. And as I've argued elsewhere, I think the key isn't so much about interaction writ large, it's about how we participate. How do we socialize? What are the ways in which, what are the institutions that we agree to exchange, that we agree to adopt, that we buy into, versus those that we don't? Maybe it's okay to trade and learn from nearby communities, but not necessarily to intermarry or breed. In other cases, it may be just fine to do all the above. And for us to sort of think of the genetic record as this sort of deus ex machina that kind of gives us a picture of the entirety of the social world would be a mistake. And likewise, I think it's a mistake not to leverage the power of the genetics to understand the complexity of these archaeological communities as we watch them unfold over thousands of years. So without going into further depth, and I have slides prepared about the horses and what other things if you're interested in talking about them. But for now, I just want to say thank you to a number of people, specifically, and many who are not mentioned or listed on this slide. This is just my array of top-notch students who have contributed so much to the ideas here, and many of whom are still working on it. And you can stay tuned for more conversations about how this plays out in Tibet and other regions of Central Asia and Eastern Eurasia. So with that, I'll stop and say thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Michael, for this fascinating lecture and for unpacking a lot of things that I have difficulties to understand or to digest. So it was a great lecture. Would you mind giving a summary in Russian? And I'm just gonna stop the recording at the moment, and then you can give the summary.